Why do you lose control? At 10 p.m., the Buddha's secret to habits. You may remember those old commercials. It's 10 o'clock. Where is your child right now? Okay, it's time to meditate. Where is your mind right now? Where does it gravitate? If you weren't to tell it to meditate, if you weren't watching over it carefully, where would it go? It might be going to lust, to anger. Here it is, your own mind. And when you're not riding herd on it, it seems to have a mind of its own. When the Buddha talks about being sensitive to the mind as you breathe in, sensitive to the mind as you breathe out, this is what he's talking about. The Ajahns will talk about how when you sit down to meditate, you should ask yourself, where is your mind leaning? Leaning to the future, leaning to the past, leaning to things it likes, things that it doesn't like. When you get a sense of the mind as it would operate without any control, that's when you get an idea of where you have to exert control and the direction you have to go. If it's heading toward lust, you have to ask yourself, why? What do you get out of it? Think of all those images the Buddha has for the drawbacks of sensuality, like the dog gnawing on a bone that doesn't have any meat. You can think and think and think, but there's really nothing there. Or as Ajahn Lee would say, the only flavor you get out of it is the flavor of your own saliva. You're making your happiness depend on something that's totally out of your control, and something that when you really look at it carefully doesn't really correspond to your desires for it. To lust for the human body requires that you turn a blind eye to many, many things in the human body. It's just not an appropriate topic for lust, and yet we turn it into something like that. Why? You realize that it has a lot to do with the perceptions you build up around it. As the Buddha said, when you want to understand craving, you have to understand where its real location is. There's that passage where he asks, a sight that you haven't seen, a place you haven't seen. Do you have any lust or desire there? His answer is no. But you might say, well, there are a lot of places I've never been and never seen that I would like to see. But that's not the Buddha's point. The desire is not there at the place. The desire is in your perception of the place, what you've heard about it, the narratives you've created around it. And the same thing applies to lusting for other people. It has nothing or very little to do with them, and a lot to do with your own preconceived notions. So the problem is in here. We focus on the parts of the body to remind ourselves that this really is not where you're going to find any true happiness, any true beauty, without a lot of downsides. So that turns you around and you ask, well, what am I doing this for? The mind is very changeable, so you have to watch for it. It'll say, no, I don't like it. Then a second later, it goes back. Why? The same with anger. You can get really worked up about something that someone has done or said, and a minute later you've forgotten about it, and you're off someplace else. What's going on? It's as if the mind is just looking around for something to feed on, and if it can't find anything really good, it'll take whatever it can get, until it finds something better. Then it drops what it had and moves on. Ask yourself why. Look for the allure. And you have to dig down many, many levels to find the allure, because often the mind likes to lie to itself. In fact, that's often one of the first things you begin to realize as you try to get sensitive to the mind. It simulates. It pretends to want one thing when it actually wants something else. Well, who is it performing for? Look into that. Who's in charge of the conversation? It's because the mind is so quick that you have to be quick too, to figure out where it's going why it's going, and what you can do to counteract it. All too often, the mind makes its decisions when it's really out of control. When the body is weak, when you're sleepy, or you're tired, generally in a grouchy mood, you can do and say things that you ordinarily wouldn't do. Yet it's at times like that that important decisions are being made. After all, think of the decisions that'll be made as you get older, as you begin to get sick, and as you're dying. The body is going to be weakened in all those cases. The synapses may be firing a little bit slow, and it's all too easy just to fall in line with your old habits. Whatever direction the mind has been gravitating so far, that's where it's going to go. One of the reasons why we practice meditation is to keep training the mind in new habits, because its old gravitational center is based on old habits, and you've got to learn new ones. These new habits have to go deep, and they have to be quick if they're really going to counteract the unskillful ones. So we get the mind into concentration, give a few karate chops to the things that would pull it out of concentration. In other words, deal with these issues in a way that gets you past them quickly, so you get the mind in a position of strength, and then you're going to have to turn around and look more carefully at its distractions. Ajahn Lee's image is of the difference between cutting down a forest and burning up the logs. When you cut down the forest, you can see things you couldn't see before, but you've still got a huge pile of dead trees. If you want to walk across the forest floor, all these fallen down trees are going to get in the way, so you have to burn them up. In other words, go back and look in more detail at your lust, at your anger, at your delusion, but come from a position where the mind is feeling relatively well fed, relatively secure, more soundly based, more soundly grounded, so that you can see things a lot more clearly. It'll be less and less inclined to want to fall in with your old ways. If you catch yourself suddenly slipping, you've got to go back. Just plant the mind in its object of concentration. Make sure it stays there for a while, and when it feels solid enough again, then you can entertain some of your other thoughts again. It's in this way that you get more and more sensitive to the mind in a way that's really useful, because building on the step of being sensitive to the mind, the Buddha says, then you gladden it if you find that it's down, and then you concentrate it or steady it if you find that it's wandering around too much, but in particular, you release it from whatever its attachments may be. Then you go back to that step of being sensitive again. It goes around and around and around. All too often, you deal with a problem once, and it's not really dealt with. It's going to have another angle the next time around. The mind's like a little child. If you thwart it in one direction, it's going to look and look and look to find another way to get around you. So you have to keep coming back to these topics again and again and again. As Ajahn Mahabua used to like to say, you may have contemplated the body many times, but you can't say, well, I've contemplated it 20 times, or 100 times, or 500 times. That should be enough. You have to keep doing it again and again until finally something gets understood that wasn't understood before. Because it is a question of understanding. It's a question of discernment. You can't just browbeat the mind into not having lust or not having anger. You have to understand where it was coming from to begin with, why it was gravitating in that direction, and what the gravitational pull was. When you finally see it, and you see that it was based on some really stupid ideas, that's when you let go. That was Ajahn Suwat's favorite translations for the word avijja. It's usually translated as ignorance, but he said it's basically stupidity. It's not simply not knowing, it's doing stupid things even when you know better. So that's what you've got to get sensitive to. That's why it requires some good, strong concentration, because we don't like seeing our own stupidity. We cover it up. But when the mind has settled in, has a sense of refreshment, a sense of well-being, a sense of being at home here, then it's harder and harder to knock it off balance. That's when you're more likely to see and more likely to be willing to admit what you see, because it's only then that you'll really be able to work yourself free. Where perceptions can take you. One of the basic teachings of the forest tradition is that if you want to understand the aggregates, it's not necessary to go following all five. All you have to do is focus on one of them. If you really get to know that one very thoroughly, then the other four will come running in right there. The insights you gain into the one will then apply to the other four. Very often, the Ajahns focus on perception as the big culprit that's creating trouble in the mind. You read Ajahn Mahabua talking about his analysis of contemplation of the body, and you'll find that it took him a while to realize that the problem isn't with the body, it's with the perceptions around the body. There are times when you want to perceive it as attractive, and other times you want to perceive it as unattractive. The wants in either case have very little to do with the actual body. It's more your desire, and the desire shows up in the perception. Ajahn Chah talks about how he got started on really understanding what discernment was all about when he began to realize how arbitrary perceptions can be and how useful it was to call them into question. There's a passage in the canon where Veni, Ananda comes to see Ven, Sariputta, and asks him, why is it that some people gain liberation and others don't? Sariputta replies, it's because they don't understand perception. There are four kinds, and they don't see their perceptions in light of these four. So it's useful to know what the four kinds are and how we should deal with them. Sariputta said basically that there are perceptions that lead to decline, perceptions that lead to stability, perceptions that lead to distinction, and perceptions that lead to penetration. This list aims at getting you to look at perceptions not just in terms of what they tell you about things around you, saying, well, this is just the way I perceive things, or this means this. Instead, you ask yourself, if I perceive things in this way, where's it going to take me? You realize, if the way you perceive things is pulling you down, causing you to behave in unskillful ways, you've got to abandon it. As for the more skillful perceptions, you learn how to develop them, and then you realize that there are levels of skill you have to master. So you start by looking out for the perceptions that lead to decline. These basically have to do with the perceptions around wrong resolve, perceptions of sensuality. In other words, seeing something as really worthy of sensual desire, perceptions of ill will, seeing a person as really deserving to suffer, and perceptions of harmfulness, basically saying, I don't have to be responsible for this person. I don't have to be careful around this person. This person doesn't matter. I can mistreat him as I want. Those perceptions pull you down because you're going to act in unskillful ways based on them. So you have to do your best to counteract them. You counteract the perception of sensuality, of course, with contemplation of the body. Or if you have sensual desire for an object, contemplate the drawbacks of trying to acquire that object and holding on to it, and how much you're a slave to things if you let greed take charge of your mind. The perception of ill will you counteract with the perception of goodwill, but also with perceptions of gratitude, realizing that we're in debt to one another, or at the very least, use the perception that other people love themselves just as much as you do. If your happiness depends on their suffering, they're not going to stand for it. And remember, even in line with the principle of karma. The Buddha never said that anyone deserved to suffer. If they could develop the proper skills, they could learn how not to suffer from past bad actions. The act of developing those skills makes the world a better place. As the Buddha said, they brighten the world like the moon when released from a cloud. So counteract thoughts of ill will with thoughts like these. As for the perception of harmfulness, that's counteracted by the principle of karma. If you harm others, the harm is going to come back at you. Do you want that? If not, you can't tell yourself that other people don't matter. You have to take their well-being into consideration. Those are perceptions that lead you down. You want to abandon them. The perceptions that lead to stability are those that get the mind into concentration. Once you've abandoned thoughts of sensuality, ill will, and harmfulness, then the mind can settle down. But when it settles down, it's going to need a perception to hold it there. This is why we hold on to perceptions of the breath in the body, and why it's very useful to have perceptions of the breath as not just the air coming in and out of the lungs, but also as the flow of energy through the body. Because as the Buddha says, if you want to get the mind into right concentration, first, you want to develop a sense of ease and fullness, and then you want that ease and fullness to spread through the body. His analogy is of a bathman working water through a pile of soap dough. Back in those days, they didn't have bars of soap. They had a soap powder, which was like flour. You mixed it with water, and it gave you a ball of dough that you would then rub over your body. The bathman making this soap dough wants to make sure that all the powder is moistened, so that none of the parts are dry. In the same way, the Buddha sets up a goal for what to do as you're getting the mind into right concentration. You want to spread the pleasure and rapture throughout the body, so that none of the parts are dry. But he doesn't say how. Ajahn Lee is very helpful when he talks about perceiving the breath energy channels flowing through the body and the different centers of the breath, allowing the breath to flow from those centers out through the entire body via the breath channels. Some people find that if they can focus on the center right around the breastbone, breath seems to fill the body. It's connected to everything else in the body. It's as if there's a system of roads, and the breath center at the breastbone is the main intersection. When something makes it to the intersection, and the intersection is open and unclogged, then the results will spread out quickly through the whole road system. That's one perception you can keep in mind. Or when Ajahn Lee talks about the breath going down the back, down the legs, you can hold that perception in mind. Then, there are levels of breath energy, gross, refined, and subtle. You can hold those perceptions in mind as well, because those will help move you beyond just being stabilized to what the Buddha calls distinction. In other words, getting the mind into higher levels of concentration. One perception helpful here is seeing that as soon as you start breathing in, there's a level of breath energy that already has flowed all the way through the body. Some people make the mistake of thinking that if you're going to get the breath to go all the way down to the toes, you have to breathe really long to get it down the back and then down the legs. Actually, one level of the breath is very quick. As soon as you start breathing in, the whole body has already been nourished. So you can hold that perception in mind, and it makes it easier to settle down. Then you can start perceiving the directed thought and evaluation that you're doing as gross. Gross in the sense that they're burdensome, and that as the breath is moving around, it's moving perfectly fine, so it doesn't need all this thinking to help it along. Just hold that perception in mind, that the breath will flow on its own without your having to help. It's basically because you've opened the channels, you've done the work. Now what remains is the perception that as you breathe, energy comes welling up from within the body, and you hold that perception in mind. Then you start seeing the perceptions of pleasure and the perception of rapture as being kind of gross. So you focus more and more on the breath, and the breath gets more and more refined. Finally, you bring the mind to equanimity, a sense of balance, to the point where it doesn't seem like the in and out breath is moving at all. The breath energy has saturated the body. Now, if you're afraid of not breathing, you won't be able to maintain that state. So you need another perception, that you don't need to pull the air in. Tell yourself that any oxygen needs you have are being met, perhaps at the skin, perhaps who knows where, but they're being met. You can hold in mind the perception the breath energy begins inside the body anyhow, so there's nothing lacking. Nothing needs to be pulled in. What you've done is that you focused on one object, the breath, but you've changed your relationship to it by the way you perceive it, the way you perceive the body, and the way you perceive the mind in relation to the breath and the body. From there, you can go to even higher levels of concentration, based on more and more refined perceptions. You begin to notice, as everything gets very still in the body, that the motion of the breath energy was what gave you your sense of the shape of the body. Now that it's begun to calm down, the sense of the boundary between what's inside and outside the body begins to dissolve. You're left with little sensation dots, like a cloud, and you realize there's space between the dots. You can focus in on the space. You can hold in mind the perception of atoms. Atoms have lots of space between them, and there's lots of space inside them. So think of all that space connecting up without any artificial boundaries placed on it. That perception can get you into the infinitude of space, and you can hold that. You begin to perceive that the space that you're focused on extends through everything. It extends through the altar table, extends through the Buddha image, extends through the walls of the sala, the floor and the ceiling of the sala, the roof, the ground beneath you, out beyond too. You can't even see where the boundary is. You can hold that perception in mind. Then there's the question of what it is that's knowing these things. There's an awareness. You can focus on the awareness encompassing the space. Hold that perception in mind. You begin to realize there's a oneness to that perception. Well, drop the perception of the oneness. That's followed by another perception, nothingness. You can work your way up through the different levels of concentration to the dimension of nothingness by changing the perception. In this case, you're changing the object of the perception, space, awareness, nothingness, but the relationship is the same. Just holding on to the perception with a sense of equanimity, along with steady alertness and mindfulness. Those are the perceptions that lead to distinction. The perceptions that lead to penetration, of course, are the perceptions having to do with seeing all things as fabricated and unworthy of attachment. You see that there's an intentional element that goes into everything you've experienced. You also realize that everything fabricated through that intentional element is going to end. To induce dispassion toward fabrications, the Buddha sometimes talks in terms of the three perceptions of inconstancy, stress, not self. Sometimes he gives lists of 10 or 11 perceptions. The undesirability of any world is one of them. The desirability of cessation. The desirability of dispassion. These can all get the mind to the point where it realizes that it's been able to fabricate things based on perception, even its states of concentration. But these things are going to fall apart, so they can't be the ultimate goal. After all, we're conducting the noble search here. We're looking for something that doesn't die. Our perceptions die. Fabrications die. The pleasure they create is going to die. One of the images in the canon is of a tree. If the tree falls down and decays, can you say that its shadow is going to stay the same that it was originally? Well, no, of course not. The shadow follows the tree. In the same way, whatever pleasure you get out of these perceptions is eventually going to follow the perceptions in falling away. That's when the mind gets inclined to what might be unfabricated. Those are the perceptions that lead to penetration, that lead you finally to release. With release, you let them go too. After all, they are aggregates. You've used them. You've taken the aggregates and turned them into a path. But the important thing to realize about all aggregates is that they're made for a purpose. That's what the Buddha means when he says they're fabricated. Everything fabricated has a purpose. Our problem is that our purposes run at cross purposes. They're all pretty chaotic. We just sit there with these conflicting fabrications we've made, and we think, well, that's just the way I am. We forget we created them to begin with, and we had a purpose at some point. So now we learn how to fabricate these things with a clear, coherent purpose, and a clear sense of where these different aggregates are going to take us. Because the present moment doesn't just sit in the present moment, it leans into the future. It too is for the sake of something. Only when we get outside of space and time entirely will you be free from the need to think about for the sake of anything anymore. When something comes up in the mind, perception, feeling, thought construct, ask yourself, what is this for? Where does this lead? Have a clear idea that it can lead in these different directions. Either it can pull you down, or it can stabilize the mind, or it can lead the mind to even more distinctive levels of being stable, or it can take you to penetration, and on through penetration to release. These are the potentials of these mental labels and images that we hold in mind. So learn how to appreciate that they really do make a difference, that they really do take you someplace, and do your best to fashion them in a way that takes you where you really want to go.